Okay, good afternoon. This is Trish Safner in the Thompsonville Community Garden. This afternoon we're going to be talking all about soil fertility and how to preserve it. What I want to share with you today is my passion for soil fertility. It really is the key to great gardening and to great produce. First thing I'd like to talk about really is what soil is composed of. It's composed of several things, living and non-living. The living we refer to as biotic, and the non-living we refer to as abiotic. So in the abiotic part of it, we talk about air and water. That adds to 50% of the total mass of soil. We talk about mineral matter, which is comprised of sand, silt, and clay. Many people are familiar with those terms because they actually can see that when they pick up some soil in their garden. The ratio or the proportion of sand, silt, and clay determines how your soil holds water, how it holds nutrients. An example is that if you have a lot of excess clay in your soil, it tends to retain the water. It retains the nutrients, but it also may cause some flooding or some compaction, and you may notice that in some of your garden. If you have more sandy soil, it tends to be loose and allows the water to drain too quickly, and you find that you have to water more often. So that is an important part of the soil composition. And the fourth part is the organic matter. That is the most important part because that's where all the action happens, and it really is only about 5% of the total mass of soil. And as I say, this is where the magic happens. This is where all the activity happens, and it's 24/7, 365 days a year. And it's all happening without your help. Organic matter changes the soil microorganism habitat and provides the food source that ultimately becomes the food source for your plants. So there's a wonderful relationship between the plants and the soil. It's called a symbiotic relationship. And they feed each other. And the more you feed the soil, the more it feeds your plants. And so that is so important to know about preserving your soil. Now, how would you find out all this information? You would do a soil test. I've referred to the soil test before. It's an important start in planting your garden, and I'll talk more about that this afternoon. Now, referring to the biotic or the living component of your soil, we talk about bacteria, we talk about fungi, we talk about protozoa, we talk about insects and nematodes and earthworms. They're all important parts in the decomposition of the soil, and so it's important to make sure that they have a food source. The bacteria and the fungi are important decomposers, and they add to the carbon and the nitrogen source in your soil. The nematodes also help to break down the fungi and the bacteria, and eventually they become a food source. And they also help break down the nitrogen. The insects and the earthworms are the last component. They are abundant in the soil. Oftentimes you'll see them when you dig up soil that's been covered up by something like a cover crop or even mulch. They're there to help aerate the soil, and that helps the water to permeate through different layers of the soil. So all these components together make up the soil. As gardeners, it's our job to manage the soil. We are not here to change the soil, we're here to manage it. And by managing, I mean that we need to provide a diverse and healthy food system for all the soil microorganisms and the components of the soil. And by doing that, it ensures that your gardening will be successful, that your plants will be healthy, that you'll be able to hold water in your garden, and the plants will be able to absorb the nutrients through the soil. You'll be able to reduce the financial costs because you won't be worrying as much about fertilizer, and you'll have a great source of carbon and nitrogen. So those are the basic components of soil. Now I'd like to refer to how we as gardeners help preserve it. So we're actually going to move into the garden and show some of the gardens, the variety, the diversity here that helps to provide food sources for the soil. Okay, we are now at one of the beds in the Thompsonville Community Garden, and I talked earlier on soil fertility. Now is where the practice comes in and how we manage that soil fertility and how we preserve it. The first thing when you're starting gardening is the soil. The soil is the key to healthy plants because we're going to feed the soil, not the plants. So it starts with soil. This is wonderful Collins compost soil. We put this in all the garden beds at Thompsonville, and I use this in my home gardens as well. The soil here is full of microorganisms and organic matter. These are all food sources for the plants once you put them in the ground. So you want to start with a healthy soil and add some organic matter to it. How much you add is all according to the soil tests that you have gotten and received the results. I recommend using Yukon. You can obtain them at the Yukon Extension offices around the state. It takes a week or so to get the results. The results will tell you all the components of your soil, the sand, the clay, the silt, and it'll also talk about the organic matter. Ultimately, you'd like to get about 5%, and the soil test will tell you whether you have that or not and how to bring that about. They'll also talk about what rock amendments, what minerals that you want to add to the soil throughout the season to help add to the fertility of the soil. So once that you have your soil intact and it's in place, you want to remove the weeds before you put your plants in, because the weeds are actually going to take nutrients from the soil just as your plants are, and they'll be competition for your plants. So once you've got your soil in place, then you want to make sure that the soil stays covered with plants. So your plants can be the food plants, they can be flowers, they can be herbs, but covering the soil surface is key. That feeds the soil. The diverse plant roots from the different types of plants all give different nutrients down to the soil and then ultimately back into your plant roots. And by keeping it covered, you will reduce soil erosion, you'll maintain moisture, you'll have to water less, you'll have a great food source for the microorganisms, and therefore the soil nutrients for your soil, and reduce the need for a fertilizer. Next, you want to water the soil at the soil level. I've talked about this many times because it's a key component to healthy soil. If you water from above, much of the water is evaporated in the air, and it also sits on top of the plant leaves, then inviting pests and fungus to come and take over the plant and cause disease later in the season. If you water at the soil level, right around the soil, and I generally recommend you even use a little ring with your finger because it'll create a trough for the water to settle in and then percolate slowly down into the roots. So by watering at the soil, you're putting it right where the roots can then obtain it easier. And you'll reduce your water costs if you're paying for water at home. The next thing I recommend is rotating plants. Plants come in families. So the main families are the tomato family, the cabbage family, the bean family, and the squash family. They each have nutrients that need to be high during a growing season, and they each have pests and problems. If you continually plant the same plant family in the same spot year after year, you're guaranteed to have a problem. If you rotate those plants, even in a raised bed in a limited area such as this, if you switch areas of the garden bed where you're planting these plant families, it will reduce your pests and disease. So by rotating the plants, you keep a balance in the soil nutrients and you keep a balance in the plants above the soil. Planting companion plants, as I've said, is always good. It keeps the beneficial insects coming in, being active, pollinating the flowers on your plants, and it also creates an aroma that confuses the pests when they're coming in to zero in on your tomato plant or your cucumber plant. They're confused by the dill smell or the marigold smell or the basil smell. So companion planting is very smart when you're planting vegetables in the garden. Using mulch on any part of the garden is also a good idea. Anything that's open to the air is open to drying and loss of water. So by adding a natural mulch such as chopped newspaper, chopped hay, chopped leaves, it all serves to retain the moisture, prevent soil erosion, and ultimately that's organic matter that breaks down at the end of the season and through the winter months and adds to the soil fertility for the spring. You want to consider maybe resting part of your garden. Maybe you want to just plant in half of the garden during the growing season and rest it and put a cover crop in. What that will do is that will maintain soil moisture and fertility, and it gives it like a recharge for next year when you go to put plants in. And speaking of cover crop, this is one of my favorite ways to maintain soil fertility. Cover crops come in the form of legumes or grains. The legumes are nitrogen fixing, so they absorb nitrogen from the air. They fix it in the plant and store it down in the roots. So when you put a plant nearby, it has nitrogen right for its fuel for growing. So the cover crops serve as a fuel source for the plants during the season. They maintain soil during the cold months so that the weather doesn't erode the soil, and they add to the breakdown of soil nutrients. So all of these components are very important in maintaining soil fertility. And what do we get out of this? It's really not a lot of work, but what you get out of it, you get healthy soil. Healthy soil means healthy plants, and healthy plants means healthy people. So remember, feed the soil, not the plants. Next time we'll see you in the garden. We'll talk about good bugs and bad bugs. Happy gardening!